This is Shaping Opinion, a production of O'Brien Communications. Can you describe any time that you decided actively not to support a boycott?
Yes, and that was when people started to boycott Nike, and that was in the early 90s. That was the first time people started to think, oh, well, where do these shoes come from, and what are the effect upon people who were working in those? And I saw that Nike was being targeted because they were the leader. Everyone else had the same problem. So it didn't matter if I boycotted Nike and I bought, say, Adidas. They were doing the same thing. And I really liked Nike and I thought they fit properly. So I went with Nike, and that was a conscious choice not to do it. My spouse, on the other hand, she didn't want to buy Nike anymore. But that's what I thought. Those shoes work for me. And the other companies are doing the same thing as Nike.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Dr. Tim Coombs of Texas A&M University. He's a professor and well-respected author of several books on crisis communications. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we'll talk with Tim about one type of crisis organizations face that is rapidly on the rise, when a social issue creates controversy. You probably remember that last year, 17 people were killed in a mass shooting in Parkland, Florida. A few weeks after the shooting, Ed Stack, the CEO of Dick's Sporting Goods, which is the nation's biggest sporting goods retailer, learned that the shooter once bought a gun from his company. That's when Stack decided to make it harder to buy guns at his stores. Then he advocated that Congress adopt gun safety measures. He proactively arranged interviews with the national media, and everywhere he sounded more like an anti-gun activist than someone who owned a gun, which he does. Gun sellers, gun buyers, the firearms industry, all of them turned their backs on him, along with a few of his own employees who quit in protest. But that was just the beginning of the damage. Earlier this year, the company reported that Dick's Sporting Goods lost $154 million in sales after deciding to ban the sale of certain rifles and restrict access to other firearms. The company knows that gun owners are likely to be hunters, and hunters buy more than guns at its stores. So by taking a stand on gun sales, the company knew it would alienate a large segment of its customer base, and it would lose sales on non-gun related merchandise. The company's stock dropped, and through it all, Ed Stack, the company's CEO, said two things. First, he knew there would be backlash, and second, he wouldn't change a thing. This is just one example of a social issue creating a crisis for a company. In the case of Dick's Sporting Goods, the crisis was of its own making because it made the decision to scale back on gun sales. It knew the risks, and it moved forward with its own decision. Other times, companies and organizations find themselves in the middle of controversy over social issues, even if they did nothing. For the past few years, the hamburger chain Wendy's has been the target of protests for not succumbing to pressure on the issue of where to buy its tomatoes. Farm worker activists effectively pressured Walmart and McDonald's to buy their tomatoes from suppliers the activists favor. When Wendy's did not follow suit, the company found itself the target of a series of national and very localized protests and a boycott. Today, it's not hard to find a company in the middle of a controversy. Quite often, that controversy centers on a social issue like guns, labor, religion, freedom of speech, immigration, or the environment. Dr. Tim Coombs is a well-respected educator and a writer on crisis communications. At the moment, he's doing research on all of the factors that define a social issue crisis.
It's sort of a new situation, relatively new, that organizations find themselves in. And there's a lot of social issues out there that are pretty polarizing in society, whether you're talking about transgender bathrooms or you're talking about reproductive rights. And companies in the past never worried about these. They focused on business, and they were told, you focus on business, you don't do the social side. But now what we're seeing is they're kind of merging, that business and social come together. And a lot of that comes from the fact that organizations are now keenly aware of and involved in corporate social responsibility, or what we just call CSR for short. And that changes their landscape and some of the demands placed upon them. So now social issues are also business issues. And I've been kind of looking at how those have been coming together and the impact that has upon managers who have to deal with risks and crisis in organizations. Because these are now new risks that they have to deal with that they never had to face before.
Well, I know from talking to some of my listeners and some other people that people hear terminology that we use in public relations, but they don't quite know exactly what we're talking about, so they need an example. And one of the examples we started this podcast off with was the Parkland shooting and the reaction on the part of Dick's Sporting Goods. And it wasn't just Dick's Sporting Goods, because other retailers and other companies were targeted. Just as an example, after Parkland, 20,000 REI customers signed a petition calling for REI to stop carrying products made by Vista outdoor brands. And Vista, now you have to follow this you almost need to take notes if you're a listener here, because Vista owns Camelback and Gyro, but they make money from ammunition. So even though REI doesn't necessarily, it's not an ammunition or a gun company, it was the one that was targeted. Why do you think REI was targeted in that way after with that petition of 20,000 people after the Parkland shooting?
Typically, when you want to have a boycott related to a social issue, you're going to take a company that's well-known and prominently known. So I think that's why they go after REI. They're a well-known name and brand, so that's who you target, because you get sort of more media attention when you go after an industry leader, and that also sort of sends a message to others in that industry that they could be next.
And then one of the other things we talked about in the beginning of this episode was Dick's Sporting Goods. They proactively decided to put restrictions. They didn't do a blanket ban on guns in all of their stores, but they put restrictions. What have you seen from Dick's Sporting Goods and how that affected the company and this whole issue of social crises?
Yeah, I think Dick's is a great example of how companies look at social issues and think, where do I want to be? And how is that then going to affect me in terms of, say, my customers who are out there and how people feel about my organization. And it's sort of as a company committing to your social issues, what you feel is important. And in that case, they committed to, okay, this is an issue with gun violence, and this is going to be our position. We're going to take a stand, that we're aware of what's going on. We're not responsible for it, but in some ways we can be linked to it. So it's a way of being safer. And you saw that also with CVS, when CVS decided they weren't going to sell cigarettes anymore. That was a big chunk of revenue they were willing to just let go, because they're like, we're a healthcare industry. Why are selling cigarettes? And cigarettes and when you're talking about tobacco and alcohol, those are some in gambling are called sin industries, and those can kind of lead to questions about how responsible you are. So it all kind of comes together in those sorts of moments for companies to think, who do we really want to be, and how do we want to project that out to our customers that are out there?
Well, we know that Dick's Sporting Goods made a proactive decision on this. One of the first things we talked about in this episode that you and I talked about was boycotts. What other ways do social crises manifest themselves outside of boycotts?
You see a lot of it now through social media. And what they do is they target. Sometimes they'll target the company's own social media space, whether it be Facebook or kind of targeting Twitter accounts, or it's the organization having its own sort of social media accounts. And when you look at organizations such as Greenpeace, they tend to use their own media, although they have sometimes gone and taken over other corporations as a way to make a point. But that's how to get the word out about what the company is doing, and then to try to then build pressure on them for people to realize the problem and then to kind of take action through social media. A good example of that is, although this has been going on for a long time and they've slowly gained traction, was to talk about the fact that a lot of the chocolate comes from child slave labor, and to try and put pressure on that. And I just saw the other day there was a story in the Washington Post about it. But Green America as an organization has been working on that issue for close to a decade now. And they use some boycott strategies, but more likely they're going to use information saying, hey, are you aware of this? And then they leave it up to the individual to decide, oh yeah, I don't want to support that company or not.
It usually all then comes down to whether or not the public will support the company. So even though it's not an active boycott, the goal is to put some kind of economic pressure on the company, isn't it? There are other ways too, traditional ways, I guess. You mentioned social media backlash, but then there are street protests and picketers and other types of protests that we see. But even those street protests are geared towards generating media coverage. I know that I've seen some of that myself in some of the work that I've done. You mentioned social media. They have a term for social media attacks on companies. They call them social media storms, Twitter storms. So if a company is not in favor with a certain activist group, it's not uncommon for the activists to come up with a campaign and build they'll mobilize their troops, so to speak, and they'll attack the company with a social media storm. How effective is that?
It's mixed. I think people think it's effective all the time, and it's not. A lot of times they come out, and they're things that the companies just don't agree with. They have a right to disagree with what the protesters are presenting, that those are not our values, and that's not what we want to do. And so we don't have good statistics on how many succeed or fail, but that's not a guarantee of success, because the company really has to look at that and think, what are the values being presented by these activist groups, and are those the values we want in ourselves, and to then reflect out to the people who support our organization.
I remember one time when I was at an event, and there were protesters at the event, and it was interesting to watch how they did it. It wasn't an environmental industry, but it was an environmental protest. And I watched the protesters. They looked like people from Woodstock. They were young people, but they looked like people from Woodstock, and they were actually serving barley soup and playing the guitar up front. And I watched that, and I walked around the corner, and I saw the bus they got out of, and it looked like a rock star bus. It was in fact, there were three of them, and they had branding on the side of them. They had a multi-million-dollar operation, air conditioning, and that's where the protesters were actually going to eat, and they weren't subsisting on barley soup. Yeah. So my question with that in mind is, how much of this is very sophisticated media work and not grassroots?
I would probably say the majority of it is actually governed by some sort of organization and activist group that's very active, and you have them across the spectrum. Conservative, liberal, middle of the road. There are so many of those groups out there now that try and bring action to come about that way. So you probably see very little truly kind of grassroots efforts.
And I've even seen one of the models that activist groups use is they will have a protest, a petition or something like that, and they will use that to get the traditional media to cover it, and it becomes a cycle. Then the traditional media portrays it then on their own social media, and it turns into a cycle, and hopefully from their point of view it builds and puts this pressure on a company. But as you mentioned, the activist will sometimes target a company that's not involved in the actual issue or at fault. The Nike example you used is a good one. How is that something that's more new, though, that companies that are not involved in the middle of a situation or didn't create the situation are targeted for this type of thing?
Yes, and you've seen that more and more. The companies that seem to just they're related on a tangent get drawn in. And that's why managers inside the organization have had a hard time realizing that, because I'm thinking, well, that's not really us. That's sort of out there somewhere, but people make the connections to them and they have to respond to them. So anymore, you're sort of responsible for a lot of things in the past you didn't think were your responsibility. That, when you think about like your supply chain, where things come from, and you're going 4 or 5 steps down the supply chain, and they're saying, well, no, you're still responsible for that. That's a big change.
The activists won't stop at just protesting or just doing something online. They'll actually go to an employee's home and protest out in front, they'll do some outrageous things, won't they?
Yeah, and that's when it starts to kind of cross a line, particularly when they go to some employees. I've been involved in some research actually over in Denmark, looking at some cases where they've taken a little too far and have started targeting employees. And there's a kind of sense that, yeah, your CEO, he or she is kind of fair game because they're a public figure and they're heavily involved, but your rank and file employees, that's really sort of inappropriate to go after them. And, they have to have lines, and activist groups sometimes do step over the line.
What have you seen from the standpoint of situations where they have done it?
Yeah, when they start putting out phone numbers of people and then people's email addresses and telling them to send them messages, to call them, and that starts to become harassment and bullying at that point. Like I said, CEOs, yeah, that kind of comes with the territory, but other workers, yeah, that's just not right. They didn't sign up for that. They have jobs to do. They're trying to make a living. They have families to support. They have mortgages. They have children in school, and it's overly harsh to kind of start targeting them.
What should a company do when it's not at fault, but yet it's targeted for something like this?
That's when a company needs to defend itself. If they think it's important enough, if they feel that, people are starting to notice this and it's starting to get attention, because that's where the protests have their big effect, is that they're going to chisel away at your reputation, which eventually hurts you as an organization financially. If you think it's bad enough, that's when you take your stand and you make your position and say, this is where we are and this is what we're doing. Now, do you want to get in a give and take with the activists? No. You want to state your position and tell them, if you have these issues, we'll talk offline. But here's our stated public position so people can see it, and then they can make their decision where they stand on it. And you've seen companies do this. Cheerios did that when they were attacked over their advertising. They defended their position. And Ford Motors has done this as well. Honey Made Graham Crackers, they've defended their position, saying, this is what we believe. And now you can side with the activists or you can side with us, but here's who we are and what we believe in.
Let's talk about a Cheerios example. Why was Cheerios attacked in the first place?
They were attacked over the fact that they used an interracial couple in their advertising, and people didn't like that. They thought it was inappropriate.
So they defended themselves.
Mm-hmm. They said, this is life in America. These are the people who buy our products.
And you mentioned Ford. What was Ford attacked for?
Ford was attacked over the fact that they had extended benefits to same-sex partners. And this was over a decade ago. So they were actually fairly progressive. And they were faced with a boycott by some groups saying, we're not going to buy your trucks anymore. And Ford took a few days to think about it, and their CEO came out and said, no, this is who we are. We believe in equality and fairness for all of our employees, and so we're going to stick with this position.
One of the issues at the core of this, and it's a concept that if you watch reality TV, you wonder where it went, but the concept of shame.
Yeah.
But yet at the same time, when you look at social crises, that's exactly what activists are trying to do. They're trying to bring shame down on certain organizations or people. How would you describe shame in 2019?
Yeah, I still think it holds for organizations, but you're right. There's a lot less shame within society for that, so it's easy to kind of deflect some things. But I think organizations still feel bad. They don't want to be thought of badly. Corporations, why we think of them as these entities out there, they're people. They're populated by people, and they have friends and they have family, and they want to be able to respect where they work and tell people where they work. And so there is a sense of shame when it's like, you're involved in that? Isn't that terrible? And yeah, I guess that really is bad. Maybe we should do something about that. Because when you work for Hershey's and people are talking about, hey, you get your stuff from child slave labor, why are you doing that? Well, they are working to correct that. They have some policies in place to try and kind of end that problem. But yeah, that's a shame issue right there. And you're exactly right. It needs to be shame-based. And if you're a company that's not easily shamed by your management, then yeah, you're going to ignore a lot of this.
Does it affect them in a negative way if they're not affected by it, or if they do ignore it?
Most times it's minimal, I think. Sometimes it can spiral a little bit out of control. Most of the time it's more sort of like it's something that's annoying, And so as managers, you want to get rid of it. It's like, well, I can make this go away. They have a point. I'll agree with their point, and we'll move on. Versus when it gets a little bit more serious, when it starts moving towards the core of your business, that's when you really kind of need to fight back.
Well, there was a crisis years ago. It's a classic now, and it was the Exxon Valdez when that happened. And the reason I bring that up now, even though it wasn't a social crisis, it became a social crisis because of its effect on the environment. But what happened was you had a tanker that was that spilled a lot of oil up near Alaska. That oil caused a lot of damage to the environment, and as it turned out, the pilot of the boat, the captain of the boat, was drunk, and that was the core of the problem. But the takeaway from a communication standpoint was that it was said or reported that that Exxon's leadership did exactly that. They said, let's give this time, it'll go away. Give it a couple of news cycles and it will go away. Have we learned anything from that time?
Yeah, I think they've learned that things don't go away. That the news is too different nowadays, particularly when you have multiple 24-hour news networks and you have these digital news outlets as well. There's so much more possible attention on you. That in the days of just newspapers and a couple of major networks, that might work. But now you can't have that. It can get picked up in other places. It gets reborn. People bring it back. You can't really hide from the news like you used to be able to.
Well, there are some statistics that I saw that were pretty interesting. There's a company called Compare Cards, comparecards.com. It's a site for credit cards. They conducted a survey earlier this year, and they asked Americans their views on boycotts. So that's, as we talked about, a very key part of a lot of social crises. 26% of Americans said they are currently boycotting a company or product that they had spent money on before. And 32% said they had boycotted at some point over the past year. And then 53%, which is more than half, said they would no longer shop at their favorite retailer if it publicly supported a person or cause they strongly disagreed with. How social savvy are consumers these days? Are they more social savvy, or is it spurred on by social media? What do you think the climate is today?
I think it's a mix of the two. I think you're seeing really, and it's been growing each year, a truly sort of socially conscious set of consumers that are out there. The data is always a little bit misleading because a lot of times when they ask people, because it's good, like they talked about people who actually said they boycotted, because a lot of people ask, like, hypothetically, what would you do? Oh, well, the numbers are big, they're 80, 90%. Say, oh, well, I only shop socially consciously. When you look at it, the numbers are closer to what you found, like they're pointing 25%, 30%. But those have been growing. Those are up from what used to be 5, 10, 15%. And once you start hitting that range, 25%, that's a pretty big percentage of your consumers that are out there. And that gets the attention of organizations. And so when you track that over time as an organization, even if it's just 20, 25%, 30, 35%, that's a big chunk. And so there's a way for you to think, all right, if that draws them in, I'm going to do that because that enhances my competitive position. And if I don't do that, I could lose some of my current customers. So there's that draw. But it does get overinflated a little bit because when you ask people hypotheticals, you're up in the 80s and the 90%. People saying, oh, I only shop, socially consciously. Or, oh, yeah, I would definitely boycott. The reality is a little bit different, but it's big enough to push companies to start thinking about it.
In your own research, are you sitting down with a lot of communications people on the company or the organization side, or the senior leadership who are making these decisions?
Yeah, that's one of the things over the past few years when I get a chance to talk with the people who are out there doing the work, is asking them about it. And that's the thing that they have the biggest trouble with, is these new developments for social issues and so forth. As I was talking to an executive in a mining company, and they're just like, whoa, we did mining, and we had mine safety, and we had an environment, and we had safety regulations. And now there are these other concerns that people are raising, and they're bringing up issues about human rights. And we just never thought about those before, but now we realize we need to, and we need to start moving in those directions. And a lot of companies are finding themselves in a situation where they thought, that's completely irrelevant to our business. But now it gets drawn to their business, and they need to think about their positions on those issues.
There was another study I wanted to bring up, too, that was related to this. In the fall of 2018, a firm called Sword and Script conducted a poll of hundreds of U.S. adults. And here's what they found. They found that younger consumers want companies to take a stand on social issues. So it's not that they just boycott. They want companies to take a stand on social issues. At the same time, though, the survey found that companies risk alienating half their customer base if they do take a stand. 49% said organizations should not weigh in on political issues. Only a third said they should get involved. So you have a real dilemma there if you're a company, because in using Dick's Sporting Goods as our earlier example, they made a decision on guns. They lost a large millions of dollars, over $100 million, as a result of that decision. So you're not going to make people 100% happy if you take a stand on these issues. So you have people saying, I don't necessarily want the companies that I do business with to take a stand. What have you seen in that front?
That's where sort of the data, like, it gets very confusing if you're a manager, because it's like, yes, we want you to take a stand on a social issue, but what that doesn't tell you is, I do, but I want you to take the stand on my social issue and my perspective. Well, social issues by their nature are very polarizing and divisive. So anytime you take a stand on an issue and you go on one side, you are going to be upsetting the other side. So you are going to get some blowback on that as a part of it. And that's one of the reasons companies didn't want to get involved in these before, because they're not really winnable. You kind of do it because now you need to be involved in it, but it's not a huge victory for you when you do it. Unless you know that your core customer base is, say, 70-80% behind an issue, then you're pretty safe. But most of the time you don't have that. And so you have them talking about, then you have people saying, I want you to talk about social issues, but not political issues. Well, those get confused and kind of run together so easily, because you can say, well, that's a social issue, and someone says, no, I see that as a political issue. So many of these social issues get politicized. Then you're in trouble because you're taking a political stance. Like, no, this was a social stance for it. So it's very tough terrain because it's not clear cut, and that's why companies really kind of have to have a sense of what are our values, and again, values you believe is what attracts people to your organization, and kind of staying true to those values. And I think overall people respect that. Even if they disagree with your perspective, they have a respect for these companies who stick to their values. And I think about companies who are kind of well known and have been brought out for their values for different groups. Chickfila, not opening on Sundays, or Hobby Lobby. That's some controversial positions, but they're kind of stuck with this is kind of what we have. They are consistent. They have to figure out who they are in terms of those values, which you didn't have to before. I mean, that typically wasn't in your mission statement, particularly if you were a traditional industry, where you produce things.
Well, that's an interesting point you brought up about Chick-fil-A, because Chick-fil-A is a retail chain, a food chain. And the management and leadership is Christian, and proudly Christian and unapologetically Christian. So when they make certain decisions, like you said, not opening on Sundays, that's a reflection of their faith, and it's a decision made by faith over business. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, what customers have found is they still like the food, they like the service, and they understand where the company's coming from, and their values are not infringing on their ability to have a quality lunch experience. There are other companies that have taken stands, companies that make cookies, companies that make shaving cream, companies that make all these different products, and they've taken stands on social issues. And one of the things that you always have to wonder about if you're the communications person is that issue important to their customer? That's understandable. If I'm a shoe retailer, as you mentioned, and I'm taking a human rights issue, and I'm going to make it in favor of how my customers would feel. In fact, Nike, you mentioned earlier, with the Colin Kaepernick situation, they won when they sided with Colin Kaepernick, and the reason they won is because the demographics of their customers are in line with their own values. So that's it. So that makes sense even from a business perspective. Have you seen any companies that have taken stands on social issues that were definitely not in sync with their customer base?
Well, an example is, it's not so much, I don't know that it wasn't in sync with its customer base, but it just didn't play well. And that was when Starbucks wanted to have the discussion about race. And that blew up on them. I mean, they had very good intentions, and it was because they were committed to this concept. And, and this was actually prior. They were starting thinking about this prior to the incident that they had with race in their Philadelphia store. But that didn't go well. It's like people saying, well, no, I'm here for coffee. I don't want to talk about race. I don't want to do this. And that was sort of a misread on their part about both kind of their customers and how people, outside of Starbucks are going to react to this. And they eventually had to drop that. And they've done some other things. And they have a history of being very good at that, of engaging around kind of social issues. As an organization, you need to be engaged with your customers to kind of know where they stand on things, because that's when you make missteps. And like Starbucks is an example of that. And Gillette didn't see things go all too well with some of their talk about hypermasculinity. They had some issues with that.
That's interesting, because you mentioned two instances where it didn't work out. And from my point of view, I thought their biggest mistake was how they executed the thing. The Starbucks one, that was, I think it was in the execution that we talk about, it was the way that they wanted to raise the issue of race. They used their cups.
Yes.
Could you describe what they did there?
Yeah, by writing messages on the cups and trying to have people engage in race through writing on cups is just not a good way to go about it, because most of the people coming through that door just want their coffee, and that's just kind of annoying to them. Like, and so, am I a bad person if I don't do this? That's just not how to. You need to allow people to naturally be a part of it. I mean, if they had something online, like saying, "Oh, if you're interested in this, go online," that would be better execution. And I agree with Gillette was just kind of too sudden, too abrupt. It didn't have the same feel like what Nike did with Kaepernick. And what Nike did with Kaepernick, they had been with them, and they launched this campaign, and as part of a larger effort, because then they bring in stuff that they do with Serena Williams. That worked. I think Gillette was like, wait, where did this come from? Why is this suddenly there?
Well, the execution on Gillette's side was it was not a Super Bowl ad, but it was on YouTube in the run-up to the Super Bowl. And what they decided to do was they basically used the term toxic masculinity, and the critics of it felt that it was criticizing traditional masculinity, and they executed it that way. And but it was publicized as a Super Bowl ad before the Super Bowl. And I thought the execution there, that was where they really made their misstep, because I think what people, in both cases, the Starbucks case and in the Gillette case, I think the consumer wants to feel when they're dealing with a company that they're not being judged. And it seemed like when the Starbucks customer has to engage in a very serious conversation just after they order coffee, they want to be in a judgment-free zone at that point, don't you think?
Right. Yeah, and that's what I mean. That it puts pressure on you when you write on the coffee cup. And you're right. Like Gillette, the people are like, well, are you insulting me? Is this about me? And as part of their target audience. And yeah, it wasn't clearly defined. I don't think they had a point, but a lot of people were offended by the point. Because it kind of points to them, and they feel like, oh, so you're saying I'm bad for doing this? And that's not what they meant, but that's how it gets interpreted. And at the end, that's what matters in communication, is how the people receiving the message interpret it. And if they interpret it as a negative, an attack on them, that's how you're going to have to cope with that.
Well, you've been doing research on this, and what's ahead for you in your research on it? What types of things are you still trying to learn and discover?
We're still trying to kind of figure out, really, when you're a manager, when people are talking about you negatively out there on social media, when is that really a red flag? And when is it not? And some of it actually comes down to the fact that if it's a very strong sort of activist group behind it that is known to be very good communicatively, that sort of raises it up for you. That's something that you need to address. Because sometimes with grassroots, you get these flare-ups when it's grassroots, and then it goes away because they don't sustain it. But But activists can sustain things for weeks, months, even years at times.
Going back to what you said earlier, a lot of activist groups are almost corporate in the way they operate and are funded, and they are in it for the long haul. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize that I explain when I work with clients on these types of things is that activist groups are by nature communications organizations. That's what they exist to do. You may exist to sell tires, or you may exist to sell chicken sandwiches. They exist to communicate and draw attention to whatever it is that's their message. Have you come across any rules of thumb so far on social crises? Any things that almost every organization should do or should think of doing if they become the target of something like this?
I think the key part is monitoring. Is you need to know when these things are coming up and kind of addressing. And to actually, you need to think about it as extending your ability to sense the environment. That a lot of times you simply missed something. You didn't track it, you didn't think it was important. Suddenly these activist groups here saying this is important, and it's not just important to us but other people, and kind of embrace that and say, oh, all right, I see what you're talking about now. Because there can be this immediate like, oh, I need to fight back. But you need to kind of sense like, okay, yeah, this fits. And think of it as more of your ability to gain intelligence about what's going on around you, and to then use that to feed in to if you make corrective actions that they want. And I think that's the key, is to overcome that immediate sort of knee-jerk, like, oh, we need to fight back. Say, oh, they have a point. Yeah, we don't want to be that company. We want to be the better company, and they've shown us what we can do. And a lot of activists are very good at that, not saying like, oh, you're evil, but it's like, well, what you're doing is no longer appropriate because the world has changed. And companies can miss that. You don't see the shifting social values in front of you. And I think for me, that's one of the keys, is understanding they can actually offer you insight. And other times you're going to see it and think, wow, that's not who we are. You fight back. Or sometimes it's like, that's just too far out there for us to even deal with, because if we don't even want to acknowledge that, because no one's going to take that very seriously.
It's interesting research. What was it that drew you to this research or this subject?
It was just sort of the growing, how activist groups, I think, were becoming much more sophisticated. And when I would teach about public relations, I would talk a lot about what activists do, because particularly when social media emerged in the digital environment, they are much more sophisticated communicatively than any corporation is. When you look at these, even some of the smaller activist groups, very sophisticated. They were the first to really sort of hire very savvy digital people to start working on their communication side for them. And in many ways, corporations are learning by looking at activist groups. And that historically has happened. If you go back even to the 70s, the concept of issues management, where you get involved in policy decision-making beyond just lobbying, activists started that, and then corporations adopted that. And that's why I became interested. It's like I'm seeing this fascinating development. They are much more sophisticated than their corporate counterparts. All I would see is corporations like, you need to be on the internet. Why? Well, we don't know. The activists know why they're there, and they know why they engage in each of these types of strategies and what they're doing and how they structure their campaigns.
Really, a lot of these companies are caught on their heels. And I mentioned earlier that if you sell tires and you're not in the business of being an activist, then these situations are exceptions for you, and they're the norm for the activists. So you're playing on their turf. So they're usually caught on their heels, and a lot of times they don't know whether this is going to evolve into a real crisis, so they kind of let it simmer for a while, and that can be dangerous. Are there any tipping points that organizations should look for when they really should start to take this thing seriously?
Yeah, that is the hardest question to wrestle with, is like, because that's how, like, when the red flags are, when it starts to tip. And right now, it's not the best indicator, but it's probably the best we have right now, is when traditional media start to pick up on it. And we alluded to that earlier, how they kind of feed into one another. Now that's going to really raise it a whole nother level, because they talk about how many people are on Facebook or Twitter, but that doesn't mean that's how many people read a message. But when you start transitioning into traditional media, and it starts appearing in major newspapers, or it's in major business publications, or on major television news shows. Now you're really reaching out, and that's going to feed back into it, and that's one of the things that I'd look at very carefully when it starts to cross over. So if you're saying, okay, I'm going to monitor this, that's one way to do it. The other way is it's kind of a more sophisticated approach. If you're doing monitoring of the digital communication that's coming in, when you notice that it's starting to spread out in a spider web instead of just kind of being circulating, because sometimes the information just circulates among a small group of people, so it's pretty narrow. But once it starts to radiate out in the spider web, then you know that's something that could just keep radiating out.
How do you know it radiates out? What are the things that happen when it's out there and it's starting to spread?
Yeah, and this gets at kind of how you visualize your data when it's coming in, because a lot of companies kind of track what's said online. So how are they saying? And your basic is a sentiment analysis, negative, positive, negative. And when it's negative, that's when you start to really worry. As you start seeing it, that people who are following someone, their followers start resending the message out, and then that's being picked up and relayed out others. So it's starting to chain out, which is your fear, because that's what makes it, a web that it starts chaining out, as opposed to, it's just sort of going back and forth between these various groups within sort of a small circle. It's when it breaks from that circle and you start seeing followers start sending things out and their followers starting to send it out, because that's your biggest fear.
So we're talking about social media, and we're basically saying, look, if you have two people criticizing you and they're just talking to themselves, that's not as risky as when those two people were complaining about you and all of a sudden more people are joining the conversation, and then those conversations are being shared with other people, and it has a compounding effect then.
Right, because say you're worried, this person on Twitter has 500,000 followers, but if none of their followers bother to retweet it or pick it up, then it doesn't matter. It's just them kind of talking within that circle and like with some other people. It's when it starts going outside of that group that it starts to matter.
When you mentioned 500,000 followers, I thought of a question I did want to ask you about, and that is celebrities. Celebrities are getting in on this game, aren't they?
Yes, they're being used as influencers, just as they've been used for years for influencers for products.
So they can create a problem for you.
Yeah, and not always an informed, because sometimes celebrities jump in and they're pretty ill-informed on the topic, and it's going to create a nightmare for you because they're saying one thing and the reality is something else.
What's next?
I think there's going to be a growing sophistication of trying to understand what works and what doesn't work. So I think we're past the initial concern, like, anytime someone says something bad online, we've got to be concerned about it, to being much more discerning. I think it's being put in perspective, and we're seeing a better integration of digital with non-digital. I think for a while, digital just became a preoccupation, which is rightly so. It's new, and so what does it do? What's going on? Well, eventually it just becomes integrated with everything, and I think it's more natural to what organizations do. So you don't necessarily anymore think about what's my digital strategy versus my traditional strategy. It's what's my communication strategy. And when I monitor, I'm going to monitor digital. I'm going to monitor other sources as part of that. So I think that's really the next sort of natural step. Is this we just sort of integrate it in, and it's now just part of the mix. And at different times, it's going to be more important than others, and that's always been a case when you've been involved with the media mix.
Dr. Tim Coombs, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. It's been fun.
To learn more about Dr. Tim Coombs and his work, please see our show notes at shapingopinion.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please let people know by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcasts. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you could get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. We have a Facebook page you can follow, and we're on Instagram at Shaping Opinion. Shaping Opinion is a production of O'Brien Communications. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.